So tonight we're going to be continuing the discussion of the prayer called the Shema by talking about the second part, which is sometimes called the V'ahavta. Not surprisingly, the first words in that prayer are V'ahavta, which means you shall love, and it's V'ahavta Adonai Elohecha. You shall love Adonai your God, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all your soul or your life, v'chol meodecha, and all your being, all your strength, your power. So the discussion which we started last week was this idea of what is raising the question: what does it mean to love God? We think about loving as an emotional response. Actually, I saw a great talk today about from a biblical scholar, and she is Christine Garraway, and she made an excellent point which appealed to me as a physicist, which says, and Jerry, you're always making this point, that we need to understand the atmosphere in which a text was written to understand the meaning of the text. So the point from physics I thought was beautiful is, if you have a little bell and you put it in a big jar and you put a stopper on the top and you ring the bell, you can hear the bell, right? If you pump out all the air in the bell, so there's effectively a pretty good vacuum in the jar. Yeah, sorry, bell jar. That's why I'm getting confused. Yeah, in the jar, and you ring the bell, you won't hear anything because sound is traveling, in this case, if you design it correctly, through the air. If there's no air, sound doesn't travel in a vacuum. So her point was, and I think it's in a way the principal point of this article is, in order to understand the text of the Torah, I can't remember the exact phrase. She's quoting one of her professors. The Torah breathes to us, inhaling and exhaling, and it's inhaling and exhaling in the context of its own times. So the first section we read last time talked about loving God and looking at ancient Near East sort of statements and contracts and statements of loyalty between subjects and regents, and this idea of loving your regent, loving your lord not in a divine sense, but master, is part of these texts. So the first point that was made last week was the idea of loving God is not so much an emotional attachment to God, but a sense of obedience and gratitude to God. And now we're going to start actually looking at the reverse side of that. What does it mean what does the text mean that say God loves us? Erwin.
What I learned at Chabad is to loving God is to know Him, and to know God is to learn Torah.
Yeah, I would say that's very classic.
Rabbinic.
Yeah, very rabbinic.
And
very
I would
poetic.
also say
Very poetic.
And mystical also.
Yeah.
Because God is in the texts, and the details of the text, and then what a Chabad rabbi would say then is, when you study Torah, you learn about all the mitzvot. So how do we love God? We obey the commandments. And they would say not only, the ones about not murdering and feeding the hungry and so on, but also keeping strictly kosher and praying 3 times a day and doing all those other things. So I would say that's sort of a mystical approach to loving God.
Rabbi, I would substitute the word loving, which is difficult, for the word believing. Believe in God. There are people that do not believe in that there is a God.
Yeah,
believing.
Yeah, so I believe in the evil of Hamas now, but it doesn't mean I love Hamas. So it's much more than believing. Or as another image that I like to say is, I believe that there is a North Pole, right? But that doesn't affect my life one bit. The issue with believing in God is, how does your belief in God affect the way you live your life? Alan.
So besides, I was thinking that I learned in Hebrew that like and love, it's the same word. So it's not necessarily the same word. You know what I mean? But in the way you just described it, Rabbi, is not the emotional kind of love or appreciation love. It's like obey, except that's
Yes.
not what it says. It doesn't say obey. So the creation of that word in the Torah has a context or a nuance that isn't the same as obey or would say obey.
Yeah, I agree with you, but what the first part, which we discussed last week, was in this time frame when you're talking about a a vassal and a suzerain, namely a lower level person in a political hierarchy and a higher level person, and you have texts which say, I promise to love you." It certainly includes the idea of obedience.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's jump
But I
into the
also want to say, I think you have to be thankful to God. Thank God for what you have, for your blessings. Thankful.
yes, I agree with you about that. I don't think that's, and I do think that's part of actually what we discussed last week, a sense of gratitude, because it's
Right.
not, it's, I guess my point is that it's not just an emotion. It's an emotion that comes with obligation. So, you know, anyway, I'm not sure how to explain it any better than that. It's more than emotion. Helena.
Yeah, I would say that, especially at certain times in your life, it's a decision almost to say that your belief or your love or your obedience to God, even if you don't feel it. I think you have to move off the feeling. And that's love to so many people is a feeling.
Yeah, so what I would say is there's a Hasidic story about a guy goes to his Rebbe or to his rabbi and say, "Rabbi, I'm having a crisis of faith. I'm not sure I believe in God anymore. What should I do?" And the answer is keep praying 3 times a day, keep kosher, feed the poor, and so on. Because Judaism in particular is focused on your actions. So I would say it's far more than what you say, but what you do. So, and I would distinguish this, and maybe Jim's gonna, well, let me ask Jim what your question is. I'm sort of anticipating. Go ahead.
I just, you keep saying, when it comes to obeying God, you keep saying keeping kosher.
I'm
Yeah.
saying that's an example of what
Okay.
a traditional rabbi would say, not what I would say, but what a traditional rabbi would say.
Okay, that sort of answers it, because I was kind of surprised, I don't know, 8 or 10 classes ago when I learned that kosher isn't that common among Jews anymore.
Okay, so yeah, I would say that's probably a true statement. What I would say is Reform Judaism focuses on the ethical Jewish law, such as how you treat your neighbors, not insulting someone, taking great care to focus on people's feelings, feeding your animals before you eat, giving to tzedakah, giving to charity, and so on. That's the Reform Jewish focus, rather than the ritual laws, which would be about keeping kosher.
Quick question, Rabbi, about that very same thing. What do you think, if you have any idea, the differences between the United States and Israel in as far as percentage of people that keep kosher?
Yeah, so what I would say is, in Israel, we know that about 80% of Jews describe themselves as chilonim, which means secular. But among those, it wouldn't surprise me if half of those keep kosher. If only, so when their parents visit, the parents can eat at their house. And also because because it's so easy to be kosher. In Jewish areas in Israel, you almost have to go out of your way not to be kosher. So I would say it's probably, I would say of the people who describe themselves as not observant, many of them, and I really don't have a good idea what fraction, would also keep kosher. I remember when I lived in Israel, I would wear a yarmulke all the time. And if I ate in a restaurant, this is in Jerusalem, not all the restaurants are kosher. If I would eat in a restaurant that was not kosher with my yarmulke on, at least one person, sometimes more, would come over to me to caution me that this is not a kosher restaurant, because they were concerned that I was there by mistake.
Kindness.
That's the guy from the kosher restaurant across the street.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, okay. Jay.
Now, in answer to Jim's question,
Go ahead,
I
Jay.
think to being a good Jew is just being a nice guy.
Oh,
Are you asking, is there a difference between being a good Jew and being a nice guy?
Oh, yes, a hell of a lot.
No, I don't know what you were asking.
Well, you were talking earlier about what makes a good Jew.
I don't think I was talking about that.
Well, that's the way I was reading it. And I thought being a good Jew is just basically being a nice human being.
Yeah, and I would
Now,
say,
I'm nice to Bryce.
right. So I would say,
Thank you, Jay.
You're
I
welcome. Don't take it personal, Bryce.
Well, I wouldn't dream of it.
The jury is still out on that.
So the way I would answer you, Jay, is I would say, broadly speaking, that is a reform approach.
Yes,
It's
yes,
certainly not a conservative or an orthodox
Oh,
approach.
definitely.
And then the question is, what are the standards you apply to being a nice guy? And Judaism has very specific laws and standards as to what it means to be a nice guy.
Wouldn't you say that the majority of the Reformed Jews do not practice Judaism the way it's supposed to be practiced?
No, I would not say that.
You wouldn't say that?
No.
How many
I wouldn't.
Reformed Jews do you know eat with a yarmulke? How many?
Oh, stop for a second.
Jews
I
do you
don't.
know
Stop for a
will
second.
not
Stop for.
mix meat and milk?
So the question is, Reformed Judaism doesn't insist that that's the way Judaism should be practiced.
But
Reform.
I'm not talking about practicing Judaism. I'm talking about being a good Jew.
Okay, so I'm going to cut this discussion short and
Okay.
summarize. The ritual issues like wearing a yarmulke, not eating milk and meat, I would say Orthodox and conservative Judaism would use that as a standard for being a good Jew, and Reformed Judaism would not use that as a standard for being a good Jew. Reformed Judaism focuses more on the ethical, and that raises the question, so what's Jewish about being a nice guy, to put it in your words? And I would say that is the flaw with Reformed Judaism. Remember, I love to quote Yitz Greenberg, who says, I don't care what Jewish movement you're a part of, as long as you're ashamed of it. I would say the thing that the flaw in Reformed Judaism is that it can be interpreted as not demanding much more than being a nice guy. And so therefore, what's the difference between a nice Jew and a nice Christian, a nice Buddhist and a nice atheist? So I would say that.
Okay.
that's
let me just add to that. Let's take the Shabbos meeting that we have at the temple.
The Shabbos meeting.
You wear a yarmulke.
Are you talking about services?
Yeah, no, the meeting that we have where we study the stuff that I don't like.
You talking about Torah study?
Torah study. All right, you wear a yarmulke.
Yes.
Rabbi does not.
Right.
I wear a yarmulke. Joel wears a yarmulke. No one else wears yarmulkes.
Right.
Nobody that's on this screen wears a yarmulke when we study Torah.
I don't know if that's true or not.
Oh yeah, I look.
Alan
I'm
Washoe is
trying to be a
pointing to
nice
his
guy.
Alan
I'm
Washoe is
also
pointing to
trying
his yarmulke.
I'm also trying to practice Judaism a little
all right.
bit.
So what's the
my
point,
way.
Jay?
Yeah,
Jay, what's
yeah,
the point?
Yeah.
What is my
Let's get to the point.
That I think I'm a good Jew.
Okay. I have no dispute with that.
Good for you.
Yeah. So yeah, Mazel Tov. But the point is, ritual issues like wearing a yarmulke are not mandatory in Reform Judaism.
You're right.
Thank you. Let's move on.
Yeah.
Okay. Did we read any of this
Just
paragraph?
want to mention, Rabbi, I went to a service at a Reform temple, just was thought, and the rabbi was not wearing a yarmulke, and I have to tell you, it really bothered me.
Okay,
It
so
found
stop for a
it
second.
very
Stop for a
uncomfortable.
second. Stop for a second. Stop for a second. Would it bother you if he didn't put on tefillin every morning?
No, that would not bother me.
Stop for a second. Putting on tefillin is in the Torah. Nowhere is the idea of yarmulke mentioned in any of the Jewish texts.
Exactly.
The issue is that bothers you, Maxine. It's
Yeah.
until recently in most Reform settings, yarmulkes were not permitted. Not only weren't they mandatory, but they were not permitted because Reform Judaism was trying to separate. Alan?
So,
Yeah.
so maybe it'll help to use the term custom versus law, because what we are used to in many times does reflect Jewish law and Talmud and rabbinic practices, but many things are customs. And therefore, a temple which has a rabbi wearing a kippah, a Reform rabbi, and another one not, we had this problem at my temple here. So I'm plainly aware that people think it's wrong not to wear one.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look a little more close, or this rabbi allowed men to light Shabbat candles, which made people crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's custom.
Yes.
But we like customs, and customs are important. It's just when you decide whether you're a good Jew or not, you have to kind of study it, like the way our rabbi here is telling us because technically, because we're Reformed, we decided to become Reformed because we decided to be a modern way of practice our Judaism,
right?
And that increases this incredible variety that is.
And let me just make a few more comments. Custom takes on the power of law. Because, if you study the text about yarmulke, that's one I'm particularly interested in, because it's not mentioned in the Talmud. You have later rabbinic text where a rabbi is saying, in my community, or my teacher is insisting that we wear kippot. I don't know where he gets this, law from, but since that's what everybody's doing, what can I do? And that's actually the response, is if it's the custom of your community, you do it. I would say one of the things I like about the change in Reform in recent years is the custom is you can make your own decision. Whereas if you went, 40, 50 years ago, and in some what are called classic Reform synagogues, even today, if you were to want to wear a yarmulke or a talit, they might ask you to take it off.
That happened in my temple.
Yeah. So anyway, so I would say Reform came from a place which said we are consciously not going to do these ancient trappings of superstitious trappings of Judaism. We're going to consciously move away from them, and you shouldn't do it. And I would say in most Reform settings that I'm aware of, you have the option to be as observant as you want. So we have members of our congregation who are strictly Sabbath observant, who wear tzitzit and so on. And you can be as observant as you want to be. Jane.
Where did the custom of wearing a yarmulke, a kippah, come from, considering that that it must have come before? Well, maybe not, must have. The Catholics wear, the Pope wears a head covering. Which came first?
Okay, so the answer, I'll just quote Tevye. You had asked me why we do this. I don't know, but it's a tradition. I have not found a definitive answer. There are suspicions that actually opposite to what you're saying, because the tradition in the Christian world was to remove their hats during prayer. You go to a church, men remove their hat.
Right.
Jews, to be different, took on the exact opposite custom of covering their heads in prayer. Another thought I've come across is Jews at one time were forced to wear, silly hats, ritual hats, to identify themselves as Jews. So they took that on as an honor. But I have not come up with a definitive understanding of where it comes from. My strong suspicion is it's much later than the popes and the cardinals
For
wearing
the
wearing that covering.
for the Cardinals, it was 1290.
Really, is that late?
That's
Okay,
helpful.
okay, then it may be earlier.
Rabbi, where did the idea come from that men and women do not sit together? You go to an Orthodox temple, there's a machitza. You don't. The men and women do not sit together.
Yeah. So what I would say is, certainly in Judaism and Islam, laws of modesty kept men and women separate. And women were not supposed to, have their arms bare. And in the Ashkenazi world, married women don't show their hair. And so there are laws of modesty. I'm actually fascinated by the fact that Christianity didn't pick up on that particular law. Okay, gang, we got to get to the text at some point. Action and affection, a suzerain, which means the guy in charge, loving his vassal. Would someone like to read? Jane, I don't know if you have another question, you can lower your hand.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. So would someone like to read?
I don't have,
I'm not seeing the text, Rabbi.
Oh, so I didn't ask if you could see the text. I just asked if you would like to read.
Oh, sorry.
Did you mean mind read?
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Yes. Now, for those of you that actually need a text to read,
Yeah. How about that?
yeah. Thank you for.
I'll read, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Okay. Action and affection, a suzerain loving his vassal. So far, I have spoken only of the love of God as Israel's love for God. What grammarians would call an objective genitive.
And I don't know anyone else who would call that an objective genitive, because I have no idea what that means. So, but apparently grammarians do.
But many biblical texts and even more rabbinic ones speak also of the subjective genitive, God's love for Israel. Here too, one can find antecedents in ancient Near Eastern treaty language, specifically in the expectation that the suzerain will love his vassal. In both instances, though, one can wonder whether love is only a technical term for obedience, protection, or whether it also carries with it anything like the emotional charge it has for modern people. I believe the latter interpretation is the likelier.
No, I'd like to stop and just point out this author is saying that there is some kind of emotional charge in the text, which surprised me.
Me too.
Remember the rhetorical situation? Deuteronomy claims to be confronting a stiff-necked and inveterately rebellious people with the need to re-enter and renew covenant, 9:7:24, 13:31:27. Obedience to the covenantal norms is not the current reality. To restore that long-lost circumstance, the authors must elicit in their hearers the motivation to make a profound change. Without the stress on the subjective dimension and the importance of self-reflection, the rhetorical goals of the Deuteronomic addresses cannot be met. Emphasizing God's love for Israel and Israel's correlative but sadly neglected obligation to love God makes perfect sense in this context.
So it's worth, clarifying a little bit. If we understand Deuteronomy as being a later addition to the Torah during a time when Israel was straying and the king in charge, which was King Josiah, wanted to centralize worship and get more control over the Israelite worship, one way of doing that is to speak about the idea that God loves the people, and therefore we should be responding in kind.
God set his heart, Hasak, on Israel. Some details of language also suggest that the terminology carries an emotional charge. In Deuteronomy 7:7, for example, to cite one last verse from Parashat Be'echanan, the verb hasak is used to describe God's choosing and loving the people in Israel. Elsewhere in Deuteronomy, the same verb appears in reference to an Israelite warrior's laying eyes on a beautiful foreign woman whom he wishes to wed. In Genesis 34:8, it describes the attitude of the Hivite prince Shechem towards Jacob's daughter Dinah, with whom he has illicit sex and whom he now desires to marry. If the verb has the same meaning in Deuteronomy 7:7 as in those other instances, one can see that, along with the obligations of a covenantal suzerain, God's love for Israel has a passionate character analogous to human sexual eros.
Yeah, I was really surprised by this. So I presume you can see Safaria? Yes. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So here is that verse 7:7. And the context is, you know, go into Israel, don't intermarry with the non-Jews. They'll turn your children away. Instead, you know, tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, consign their images to fire. For you are a people consecrated to your God. Of all the peoples on earth, your God, Adonai, chose you to be God's treasured people. I'm just looking. Yeah, Adonai Elohecha. So it's both words. And a treasured people and Am Segulah. And it's not because you're the most numerous of peoples that Adonai grew attached to you and chose you. Indeed, you are the smallest of peoples. So with Lo merubim mikol ha'amim hashach Adonai. So it's hashach here seems to be is being translated as chose, and just looking at the dictionary definitions in Safaria, to love, to be attached. This I just plain don't know. Filet. I am lost. I'm not even sure what English use of the word. I don't know if they're talking about a fillet, like, you know, fillet of soul, or they're talking about fillet meaning a loyalty, fealty, but that's not spelled the same way. So I'm completely puzzled by that. But certainly to be attached makes sense. So my soul has chosen the law, I elected you, and so on. So apparently that's another word which this author is translating as love in some sense, and has almost an erotic connotation
Rabbi?
connected with it. Hold on a second. First Cheryl and then Alan.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, you know, he mentions Dinah here, but you know, when I think of Dinah, I always think of the rape of Dinah. So, you know, to say this word Hasak is being used there.
Is it Hasak or Hashak? I wasn't even looking how it's pointed. Yeah, Hashak. It's a shin, not a sin. Yeah. So anyway, if you read the story of Dinah carefully and closely, although it's often called the rape of Dinah, it's not clear whether he took Dinah by force. I mean, that's what the whole story of the red tent is about. That in fact he loved her. In fact, he was willing to go through some surgery in order to cement that covenant, and that literally led to his downfall. But the interesting thing in the three examples given here, an Israelite warrior laying eyes on a beautiful woman he wishes to wed, Shechem toward Dinah, and I thought there was another. Yeah, so that's the only two examples. It's sort of physical attraction leading one to enter into a covenantal relationship, but it's not platonic. So anyway, it's some interesting examples. I have to admit, I never focused on this word hashach before I read this. Okay, again, Jane, I'm going to lower your hand. Do you have another question or no? Okay.
It's hashak can be to press or to tie.
You're finding that in another dictionary, or?
Well, if you look at a dictionary, but it says it in Safaria as well.
Okay. Yeah, so it doesn't sound like love, but to be attached, well, the basic definition here, to love, be attached to long for. So it's talking about God hashaching Israel, and it's interesting here that the the translation here, which is probably, you know, the new JPS, is chose you. It would be
But
interesting.
that's also fillet or fillet or whatever. Fillet is to tie. If you look at a
Oh, really?
OED or something, yeah.
Yeah, what I was gonna say, the Oxford Dictionary says it's a band, what he just said, basically, a band or ribbon worn around the head, especially for binding the hair.
Ah, okay. That is
So
news
that's
to
a
me.
metaphor. It could be a metaphor.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's continue. Joanne, you want to continue?
Is God's choosing a people unjust? The chosenness of Israel appears in a different light when it is viewed as the result of such passion on God's part. Usually, the issue is put into a framework of justice, with defenders insisting as early as Second Temple times that the national ancestors found in the Bible had proven worthy of the unparalleled status they would be given, and detractors arguing that the choice was and is unfair, an act of injustice toward the unchosen. But love does not map so easily onto justice. The fact that you love your husband or wife in a very special sense does not imply an injustice towards other men and women, nor does it imply that by objective criteria, those other individuals do not surpass your beloved in various respects. It implies rather that the two of you have a unique personal bond that resists universalization and rationalization, chemistry in the vernacular.
Yeah, and this sort of makes sense to me, thinking about almost monolatry. If the underlying idea is that there are many gods, but you know, Elohim, Adonai is the God of Israel, that God of Israel chose us, and the choice isn't necessarily rational. In fact, in Deuteronomy, you know, it says it wasn't because you're the most numerous, indeed you're the smallest of people, but because Adonai favored you and kept the oath made to your fathers, that Adonai freed you with a mighty hand and rescued you from the house of bondage, from the power of Pharaoh. Know therefore that only your God Adonai is God. Let's see, it was a Hu Ha Elohim, the steadfast God who keeps the divine covenant faithfully to the 1000th generation of those who keep the divine commandments, but who instantly requites with destruction those who reject God, never slow with those who reject, but requiting them instantly. So the theme in Deuteronomy that we see over and over again is, if you obey God, basically you're in good terms in this relationship. If you disobey God, very bad things are going to happen to you. In fact, in some ways, the whole theme of Deuteronomy and what's sometimes called the Deuteronomic historian, which are the historical books following Deuteronomy, is a way of explaining why, you know, the Israelites succumbed to the Babylonians and then to the Romans. How is that possible if we really have the most powerful, you know, God of all? How is it possible that we succumbed to these other gods? And the answer is because we didn't keep our part of the covenant.
Yeah, how did our team lose? You know, must have been
Yes.
our playing. We didn't play well. But by the way, just a quick point. So
Yep.
this is back to your original comment. The format of what you just showed follows the classic vassal suzerainty agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what the, you know, what the text is talking about, which I've never seen the concept, is what was, you know, it's funny when I conduct a wedding, one of the questions I ask the couple is, what is it that first caught your eye about the other? And you know, my wedding talk usually has some of the stuff like that in it. So I think this is almost saying, what was it that, you know, that caught God's eye in selecting Israel? And I think what this text is arguing is it's not entirely rational. It's
Maybe no one else wanted to do it.
That's possible.
That's
After
right.
all, who wants a stiff-necked people?
That's
Jay.
the midrash. Nobody wanted to accept no adultery.
Yeah, there's actually that midrash that Alan points out, that God talked to a lot of different peoples.
Yeah.
And another way of answering this question And in that discussion, God said, you know, would you like to become my people? And, you know, group X said, okay, well, what's in this covenant? And he said, well, you know, God says, don't rob. He says, well, what do you mean don't rob? That's, you know, that's one of our favorite you know, our activities. Next thing you'll tell me is no pepperoni. I mean, how bad could it get? So the idea is God went to all the peoples of the earth, explained the covenant, and the peoples rejected it because they didn't want to live up to the covenant. And Israel went overboard and said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do it and then we'll hear it. Namely, we too were taken by the chemistry with God, and we are fallen in love. And tell me the details later. But you know, I take thee to be my God. Let's see. I'm just going to go across the top.
Hate the Jewish people.
I'm sorry.
Didn't God create the Jewish people? God created us.
I stop for a second. I actually don't even know what you mean by that.
Well, we're here because we're alive. We're living because God created us.
Okay, well, didn't God create all the other peoples as well?
Well, I can't answer that.
Okay. Jay.
Yeah, go back to 2 paragraphs, please. I don't see it there, but God. Number one, where did the name God come from? What does it mean? And is there only one God? Because in the other paragraph back there, God and God's others.
Okay. So I don't know where the English word God came from. In the text, we're talking about 2 different references. Typically, the word Elohim and the word spelled Yud He Vav He.
But in English, don't we accept both those words as God?
No. In English, we accept the word Elohim as meaning God, although let me put it this way. Almost every translation into English translates Elohim into God.
Okay.
Translates Yud He Vav He. All the older translations translated Yud He Vav He into Lord, but not God. But the understanding is Yud He Vav He is God's proper name, like Sam or Fred or Mike or Jay.
So let's accept the word God. Tell me, is he the only God, or are there other gods?
So I would say in the early books of the Bible, it is clear that the Bible is talking about a world in which there are lots of gods, and the God of Israel is the unique God of Israel, and more powerful than other gods. And then when the Bible turns to the prophets argue that there are no other gods, that Elohim or Adonai or Yod He Vav He is the only God, and all the other gods are false gods.
Rabbi, is Elohim a plural?
Elohim has a plural form, but it's grammatically treated as a single.
Oh, thank you.
And it probably is a vestige of people talking about the gods.
Like the we are not amused, you know?
No, but that's exactly a counterexample, because we are not amused. The verb are is a plural verb.
Oh.
So the example that would fit the Torah is we am not amused. So and that is actually in the second word of the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created, and the verb bara is in the singular. If it was in the plural, to match Elohim, it would be baru. So that's maybe more technical than you're looking for, but it is one of the many oddities. And if that's not
spectacular example is Windows is shutting down.
Right. So yeah, Windows is a singular noun when it's referring to a computer operating system, and it's a plural noun when it's referring to fenestration. And back in the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Birds, they took great glee in promoting it with billboards saying The Birds is coming, because it's a singular noun. It's the name of a movie. Jim, you guys give me a workout. I just want to point out, I feel sometimes like a goalie in a hockey warm-up. You know how when they're all firing pucks? Anyway, I do enjoy it. Yes. So, Jim.
Yeah, earlier it said, I didn't choose you because you're big. I chose you because you're the smallest. It's been my understanding that God chose the Jews. He had to choose somebody to reveal God's self. And there's no point in choosing the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Romans or the Persians because they're huge and powerful anyway. Everybody's going to go, oh, well, of course that religion took off. Look how powerful they were. So he chose a people with no king, no land, and no army. And that's right? That's my thought as to why the Jews were chosen.
I would say that is a very interesting drash. And
I think he's got
I wouldn't disagree with it. On the other hand, what's up with all you Christians? I mean, a third of the world is Christian. Don't you believe you're chosen?
Dead silence.
We weren't the people that God chose to reveal himself to mankind.
You believe
those were the Jews.
Okay. Well,
You
Muslims
know,
also believe that the final perfect revelation was to Islam, a very powerful nation as well.
And you know, and I have no issue with that.
Okay.
You had to choose somebody.
Okay. Okay. I like it. Okay. Erwin?
Yeah.
My drush is, or what I heard, or what I learned, is that God chose them because they were at the lowest ebb of their morality, and God had only a certain time to save them.
Oh,
And
that's I never heard that one. I mean, that sort of says God couldn't find anyone worse.
yeah, exactly.
Oh.
Exactly. And
I
have
like
one more
Jim's.
question.
Yeah, can we go back to Jim's definition?
Rabbi, I have one more question. When in the previous pages, when God is saying, or whatever the statement was, that you have to marry your own kind or something.
Yes, don't intermarry. Yeah.
Yeah. What happened when Moshe Rabbeinu married somebody else? God said, "Oh, that's all right. You're gonna be the leader. You can do whatever you want."
It's a great question. Moses marries a Midianite.
Yes.
I mean, if you go back far enough, if the Jewish people start with Abraham and Sarah, then somebody's got to intermarry, or it's going to be a pretty small population. So, but it's a great question, and there's a lot of commentary about that. But you know, if you look at this as happening, if you look at Deuteronomy in a historical context, that it's really being written much later than the time of Moses, then what they're trying to do is whip the people into shape and stop all this intermarriage, because there's probably a lot of intermarriage going on. So Josiah is probably trying to whip the people and keep them from intermarrying. Same thing happens. You see similar language in Ezra and Nehemiah to forbid intermarriage. In fact, even to force people to divorce their non-Jewish spouses. Alan.
I think it had to do with the whole idea of choosing. In other words, I might have missed where we got to that, but I would start by making the statement that in creation, there's a sequence of events related to it's not about choosing. Or maybe choosing Abraham was a choice, but Judaism and the people, I guess I feel like that sort of was part of the plan without God got to any kind of crossroads about
my own theory on that is that in the early books of Genesis, like chapters 1 to 11, God tries preaching or speaking to the entire world. You know, don't eat the fruit of the tree. That's Adam. 10 generations later, we're in the time of Noah, And clearly that hasn't worked. And then the first thing Noah does is, when he gets on dry land, is get drunk. And in the next story in Genesis, they're building the Tower of Babel, and that's not working. So my own theory on this, and I've heard others say this as well, is that it basically God is shifting strategies and saying, well, look, if I speak to the entire world, it's clear that that doesn't work. So I'm going to shift strategies and work through one family. And indeed, the call to Abraham is that every family will bless themselves through you. So
it's not coincident, unless you want to make it, that we are studying that this week.
yes. So nothing's ever coincidence. So yes, Jim.
Yeah, you said this twice, that Josiah tried to whip the people into shape with Deuteronomy, but doesn't the story say that he found this document, tore his clothes, and then everybody repented and
Yes.
hair? So if he found it, you're talking as if Josiah wrote it. I'm confused.
Yes. So the question is, what did Josiah know and when did he know it? And, was it truly just found? If I take the story literally, then he found it, and he actually goes to a female prophet to determine Huldah, to determine whether it's a real book of Torah. So the way the story reads, Josiah found some document, and it's not clear what the document is. Scholars believe it's the book of Deuteronomy. And so if you take with a grain of salt, that it wasn't just something that had been lying around for about 400 years or so, but he actually found it, then there's some suspicion that he might have had his scribes create it to affect centralization of worship. That's what Deuteronomy does. It says you can't just sacrifice any place you want. Everybody's got to come to Jerusalem to sacrifice, and a lot of other things as well. So I'm adopting sort of that scholarly interpretation, which if you read the Bible literally, you would not come to that.
Sort of like an ancient Joseph Smith.
No, I won't because it's forbidden. Because it's forbidden under Jewish law, and ethical Jewish law. So I wouldn't cast aspersions on Joseph Smith, or, the way Mormons read their sacred scripture is Joseph Smith discovered their sacred literature. And Mormons wouldn't.
My bad.
Yeah. Mormon, I don't know if Mormon scholars would say that it's a deliberately written. Erwin.
Yeah, I have difficulty to comprehend when you are saying that if you believe the Torah literally, or you believe, or you understand that God wrote it, because we are studying it every day and we're getting an uplift spiritually from the commandments. And so if you do as I think I have to divide the Torah, the first part as a historian document, and the first part are the laws which are given by God. So that's I understand, but I cannot say that the whole Torah is literally written by whoever decided to write it.
So anyway, what I'm saying is there is spiritual uplift and intellectual uplift and power and inspiration in reading Torah from a wide variety of different perspectives. And I would never insist that this one is the only correct one and that one is wrong. I would say that the text is so powerful that I can read it from so many different ways, and I get uplift when I read it from a scholarly perspective, and when I read it from an Orthodox perspective, and when I read it from a midrashic perspective.
You know, I speak for myself. I am not smart enough to understand completely what is written in the Torah, and that's why I am studying it every year from the beginning to the end.
Right, I agree with you.
Because I find every year something more and more interesting in it.
I agree with you, Bryce.
Yeah, so to go back to the fact that God tried various ways to interact with humanity with poor or indifferent success. I would think of that as being sort of a proof against God's infallibility.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you don't need to go that broad. Genesis 6:6. It says, God regretted having made humankind on earth, and it pained God in the heart when he saw how people had turned out.
It's
Right.
additional confirmation. It is so
Yeah,
nobody
but
can just point to the one thing.
yeah, so I would say there's a lot written about God, and there's a lot written which has different implications in lots of different ways, and the text is multivariant, and it is certainly not part of my belief that God is infallible. And you know, again, there's lots of proof text there, and it's probably not surprising that my take on all of this doesn't speak to God's infallibility. Again, I would say, you know, I would look at this as the sacred myth of the Jewish people, and there I kind of like the idea that God was sort of flailing around to get God's act together, and it wasn't working out so well. And lo and behold, God chose the Israelite people, and that dance, that covenant, that marriage now has gone on for 4,000 years. It's just like I convinced myself that, you know, my wife, you know, and was flailing around through her entire life and not achieving true happiness until she found you know who. And now she's ecstatically happy and can't find a single thing wrong with me. And so, yeah, that's the myth, and I'm clinging to it.
Probably we're having
Yeah,
trouble.
the human capacity for self-delusion is an amazing thing.
Yes.
There's a distortion in this presentation. It must be a Zoom problem, what you just said. You couldn't have said that.
Yeah, and boy, now it's on tape, and I'm going to actually publish it. Actually, once I get off the recording, I'll tell you a joke along those lines, but I'm not going to record that one. Okay, it's about 8:00. Erwin, your hand is still up. I don't know if that's from before. You have something else you wanted to add?
No, that was before.
Okay, so I appreciate that we got so bogged down in this, and then I don't have to go searching for another text to talk about next week. I will be around next week, but then I'm going to be gone for about a week. So I will be here next Monday and next Wednesday, and then gone for a week. But I'll make that very clear. I'm going to stop sharing. Anybody else have any comments they want to add?
Well, I just want to say the Torah came from God. That's God's word. That is
the traditional belief. So
well,
Maxine,
you believe in God, then that's what you believe.
Maxine, do you keep strictly kosher?
I do for my parents.
In your home, you have 2 sets of dishes?
I have. While my parents were alive, I did, because I wanted them to eat at my home. But once they're gone, and it was okay.
Okay, but if it's the word of God, why would it make a difference whether your parents were around or not?
Well, to me it did.
I understand, but if you believe it's the literal, so I would say if you believe.
Well, God actually didn't come out and say we should keep kosher. It's not specifically written that way in the Torah.
It is. In the Torah, there are lots of rules about keeping kosher.
Yeah.
Not all of them. The Talmud goes on.
Okay, but you asked specifically about the separate dishes, which is not in there.
Yeah.
But it comes from the lamb not being cooked in the milk of its mother.
Yeah. Let's not get into the details. What I'm saying is the idea that God literally dictated the Torah.
Yes.
And every word of the Torah is literally from the word of God is a valid, reasonable belief, and it's a belief that is held without a doubt by Orthodox Judaism. And I would say it's held in large part by conservative Judaism. And it is not held, I don't think, in large part by Reform Judaism.
Well, they're wrong.
Okay. You know, what can I tell you? If you call me wrong, I will admit it. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording. I want to close